Our Gospel reading today is a very well-known passage from Matthew chapter 14. It's the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 5 little loaves of bread and 2 fish. He managed to feed 5,000 men plus women plus children. This is clearly a really important story for the Gospel writers because it is the only miracle story that appears in all 4 Gospels. The only miracle that appears in all 4 Gospels is Jesus' feeding of the 5,000. Usually we focus on the miracle itself, but today I'd like us to focus on what happens around the miracle, because I think that in the way that Matthew narrates the story to us, he gives us great insight into the heart of Jesus. And perhaps the reason why all the Gospel writers included the story is because in many ways it exemplifies the heart of Jesus. And when we see the heart of Jesus, we see the heart of God. And so perhaps this is why this story, of all the other miracles, was for them so important. I'd like to focus on 5 aspects. There are more, but I want to focus today on 5 aspects of the heart of Jesus that come through in this story. Matthew picks up the story at verse 13, where he says, "When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place." And what had just happened is that John had been executed by Herod. John, who was Jesus' cousin, John, who was born just before Jesus, John, who was the prophet who prepared the way for the coming of Jesus the Messiah. He had been arrested and had been executed by Herod. And Jesus hears about this, and his response, his immediate response, is to withdraw privately to a solitary place. I love that emphasis. Withdraw, private, solitary. It's these 3 words that really emphasize Jesus' withdrawal from the world as he hears the story about his cousin's death. And I think what we learn about this is that Jesus feels, I'm sure he knows that John is in the presence of his Father, and yet he is grieving and needs to withdraw and be quiet and deal with his emotions. It tells us that he cares, that his heart is soft, that he responds to human suffering. We can think of Jesus weeping at the tomb of Lazarus. There is a tenderness in Jesus that is emotional. And in the face of death, even though he knows the whole story and how it's going to unfold, even still, he grieves in the face of death. And so in this passage, he withdraws privately to a solitary place so that he can be alone with his grief and presumably speak to his Father and pray. The second piece of it is that having withdrawn, the crowds don't want to let him go. So they follow him. And Jesus' natural response is to turn towards them. In verse 14, Matthew writes, "When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd that had followed him on foot from the towns, he had compassion on them." He had compassion on them. Another translation says that his heart went out to them. His heart went out to them. This compassion of Jesus, I think, is so manifest in the story. In fact, throughout the story, we have already seen it in response to John, who was somebody he was close to, a family member. But now we see it in response to the crowds. And remember, this crowd is huge. This is not just a handful of people. This is not 12 people, his close friends. This is thousands of people who've been following him, people he doesn't know. In fact, Matthew refers to them repeatedly here as crowds, big numbers of people, almost nameless faces. And yet as they follow him, Jesus' heart goes out to them. We know from the first theme that he feels, but now from the second theme, we see that his heart is generous and open, and that when people are in need, when they're coming towards him, his natural inclination is to open his heart towards them and to be generous and compassionate. And then thirdly, still in that same verse, Matthew 14:14, Jesus healed those who were ill. He healed those who were ill. And so before he did the miracle of the feeding, he was already healing people of their illness. Now that word ill that the NIV uses has a Greek word behind it that is used only in this place, in the whole of the New Testament. It's not used anywhere else in the New Testament. And it's really better translated wretched. People who are broken and depressed and unhappy and unwell and wretched. It's a strong word. It's more than just people who are sick. It's people who are, in many ways, the whole of their life in some way is broken and unhappy and dislocated. And Jesus comes and heals them. He makes them whole. So even though he's grieving in himself, as the crowds come towards him, his heart goes out to them and then is expressed in this activity of healing, of taking care, of binding up, of restoring, of making whole those who are suffering. We then move into the story proper. In a sense, that sets up the story for the feeding of the 5,000. In verse 15, Matthew writes that as evening approaches, the disciples come to him and they say to him, "Send the crowds away. Send the crowds away so that they can go to villages and organize themselves some food. Send the crowds away." And I'm doing it in this rather offhanded way because I think that is, in a sense, what they were saying. They were just saying, let's just get rid of these people so we can go about and do our own thing. Let them sort themselves out. And Jesus' response in verse 16 is, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. And then he invites them to sit down so that he can feed them. There is a sense here of Jesus embracing those who come to him, that he makes himself available and he embraces them, he draws them to himself. The disciples quite regularly in the Gospels try to send people away. You may remember the passage where the children were coming and they were hassling Jesus, and the disciples try to shoo them away. And then Jesus says that famous saying of suffer not the little children to come unto me. That great story. There's other times where people who have leprosy are shouting out, or people who are blind shouting out, "Jesus, Son of God, Son of David, save us, help me, heal me." And the disciples are shushing them up and chasing them away. And Jesus says, "Come to me." It happens again and again. The woman who was bleeding, who wanted to touch the hem of his robe, she was pushed away, but she touched him. And then Jesus turned around and he said, "Who was it? Who's touched me?" Other people, his followers, the disciples, are continuously chasing people away. And Jesus is continually responding by saying, "Come to me. Come to me," he says. "Sit down. Let me feed you." There is a generosity and an embracing quality in the way that Jesus handles these people, but also in the way that he very subtly, but clearly, I think, reprimands the disciples for chasing away those who would see Jesus. The disciples, in a sense, are self-centered and are looking out for their own comforts. Jesus is crowd-centered. He is other-centered, and he is thinking about their needs. And then finally, we have the actual feeding. And what I want to emphasize here about the feeding is that the disciples say to him, "Yeah, we have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." There's almost a kind of a like, what do you think we're going to do with this? 5 little loaves of bread that were probably not loaves of bread, but almost just kind of little rolls. And 2 fish that were probably quite small, not tuna, sardines. These small supplies, these little things, they're kind of like, what do you think? What do you think? And Jesus takes them. He says, "Bring them here to me. Bring them here to me," in verse 18. And then he takes the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gives thanks and he breaks the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people, and all ate, and all were satisfied. Jesus takes the small things that people bring to him, and he multiplies them. He transforms them, he transfigures them, if you want, into something far greater than what they actually are. If you were with me last Sunday, you remember that we spoke about those tiny things, the little grains of yeast and the little mustard or poppy seeds, tiny, tiny things that Jesus uses to illustrate growth. The yeast that grows and makes dough rise, and the mustard seed that grows into a big tree. Today, we get the same. He wants us to get this message. Matthew wants us to get this message. Jesus wants us to get this message. Jesus takes the little that we bring and he multiplies it. Now, it's not just that he can do that. I think what's important for the heart of Jesus is that he can see through the little things that we bring to the amazing big things that are possible. He has eyes of faith that can see that these small supplies, these 5 and these 2, that seem so insignificant, can in fact become great. They can be amazing. They can feed, they can heal, they can make whole, they can satisfy, they can comfort. So, dear friends, as you journey through your own life with all the challenges that we're facing now with COVID, as we increasingly know people in our family, at work, in our communities, in our churches who are infected or who have died of COVID, as we grapple with the isolation and the loneliness, perhaps, of COVID, as we face all of these difficulties, let us learn from this lovely story of Jesus feeding of the 5,000, of his heart, of who he is. This is who he was in that story, but this, in fact, is who he is always, for all of us. He feels, he is moved, his heart is tender, he is emotional. He is open-hearted. And when he sees us, when he sees our need, his heart opens out towards him. His heart goes out towards us. It is open and responsive to us. And he reaches out and he brings healing to our wretchedness. And he embraces us, all of us, inclusively, all of us. He embraces us. He invites us to come. He invites us to sit with him. He invites us to eat with him. And then he takes what we bring, the little that we have, the things that we might feel almost ashamed of because they seem so small and insignificant, and he transforms them because he has faith. He knows what is possible, and he encourages us to have faith and to believe that much is possible, even out of small, insignificant things. Friends, let us focus on the heart of Jesus. It is a great and wonderful heart. May you see into his heart today. May you experience his heart today. In the name of God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.